Welcome to the 2021 Cook Gray Speakers Series. It's good to be back in person. It's also good to be out there in cyberspace. But it's nice to have this talk once again, face to face. I am Pam Tolbert. I am a professor in the organizational behavior department here. And I am the Lois Gray professor in ILR and social sciences. My colleague, Rose Butt, is the Alice Cook professor of women and work. And before introducing today's guest speaker, Professor Kathleen McGinn, I wanted to, whom we're very pleased to have, I should add, I wanted to begin by providing a little background on the series and specifically on the two women for whom our chair positions are named and the series is named. So the series honors Alice Cook and Lois Gray, two labor activists and scholars with deep ties to ILR, who had a significant impact not only on the school here, but on the larger university and in the larger world beyond the university. So I want to spend a little bit of time just giving you some background on them for those of you who may not be familiar with them. One, Alice Cook joined the faculty in the early 1950s here in ILR after already having had a pretty long and remarkable career as a labor educator, a labor organizer, and also a government consultant. So Alice began her career in the 1920s after graduating from Northwestern University. She started by providing education and work advice to blue-collar women through the YWCA Industrial Department. She later moved to Arkansas to do labor education at the Commonwealth College there. And still later, she went to Pennsylvania to do labor education in Bryn Mawr's summer school for women workers. Then off to North Carolina to teach in the Southern Summer School for Workers, and then back up to New York to teach in the Hudson Shore School. So she spent a lot of her early career working with workers, providing education, advice, and some labor organizing as well. And in fact, she was deeply involved along with this labor education in unionizing efforts across a variety of industries and occupations, ranging from railroad engineers to meat cutters to a variety of groups. In addition to that, because she had done some work early on in Germany, done some research in Germany in the early 1930s before Hitler came to power, the US government turned to her after World War II for help and consultation in helping to reconstitute the German unions there, and particularly focused on making more democratic unions. So it was after all this that she came to ILR and then began her career here. She taught courses here in labor history and union administration. And on the side, she helped found the Women's Studies Program and the Advisory Committee on the Status of Women, and also led the desegregation of the faculty club, which at one time was for men only. She, recognizing her talents as a change agent and a mediator, President Corson, back in the late 1960s, appointed her as the first ombudsman of the university. And note, those were turbulent times in Cornell, so this was not an honorific position. It was recognizing her skills. In the meantime, she maintained a flow of scholarly work over her career, long after she retired, publishing numerous monographs and books on issues affecting unions, issues affecting women, issues affecting women in unions. All of this was kind of a culmination of an incredible body of work. Lois Gray, for whom the series is also named, was also an educator and an activist who, like Alice, came to the ILR school after pursuing a number of career paths that involved both government work and unionizing efforts. She attributed her commitment and her concern with unions, in part to having grown up in Depression era Oklahoma and observing racial and economic inequities at that time. Like Alice, she also studied at Northwestern University, and after graduation, during the war years, was recruited to work in a secret military intelligence agency. Then after the war, she decided to pursue her concerns with social justice by first joining the NLRB, and then a couple of years after that, ILR recruited her away. The school had just recently been formed. And so she was part of the founding faculty, playing a very important role in shaping the direction and the form that the school took. So she taught courses here in labor economics and also in collective bargaining and union governance. Like Alice, she was an activist here on campus, and with the other ILR women, she helped to found the state's first training program for women arbitrators. Also, like Alice, she continued her research long after retirement, and I think a series of publications attest to a longstanding and deep concern, particularly with women in union leadership. So in sum, this series is basically was created to honor these two women and to recognize scholars who share their commitments to creating a more just workplace, including the advancement of gender equity. So in this context, I am particularly pleased to welcome today's speaker, Professor Kathleen McGinn, who comes to us today from Harvard Business School, but she began her academic career, incidentally, here at Cornell in the Johnson School, was here for a few years before unfortunately being lured away by Harvard, where she's been a member of the faculty ever since. And she is now the Carners Robb Professor and also a Senior Associate Dean there. She very much exemplifies the ideals of scholarship and activism that Alice Cook and Lois Gray embodied. Before she began her graduate work, she worked as the Director of Labor Relations in a public sector organization, then took off for graduate school at Northwestern University. We seem to have a theme. And much of her research since then has focused on processes of negotiation, over time, increasingly on the effects of gender on those processes. I think notably, she has taken this work far from the confines of the academic laboratory and into the broad international context. And I will just briefly mention one example, a study that was published, I won't talk too much about this, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, where she and her colleagues document the effects of training and negotiation skills on the general education advancement of Zambian women. So I won't get into the details because she may be telling you about this, but if she doesn't, I would strongly recommend that you take a look at this article. It's in QGE 2020. It's really fascinating. In line with her academic research, she is also involved with several NGOs that are focused on solving problems of unemployment, especially youth unemployment in African countries. Hence her work, like Alice and Lois, extends far beyond the boundaries of the US and beyond academia. And please join me in welcoming Kathleen McGinn.
Thank you very much, Pam. That was a wonderful introduction, and it's an honor to be introduced in the same light as Alice Cook and Lois Gray. I wish I had known them. They sound like the kind of role models I'm going to talk about today. I also am so happy to just be back in Ithaca. So I left Ithaca when my daughter was 2. She's going to turn 30 in a few months. So it's been a few months since I've been here. I have visited lots of times in between, but it's wonderful to be here. And it's even more wonderful to be here on a sunny day. So I'm very grateful for the invitation. So thank you. I'm going to talk today about women's employment. Even in this 21st century, women's employment continues to be this lightning rod for political debate. We're listening to it in Congress right now, for discussions within organizations, for discussions within homes, for decisions individuals make as they go to school, as some of you are doing. Should women work? Well, certainly if they're poor, they should work. Should women work in this type of job? Well, maybe this type of job, but not in that type of job. And critical today, should women work when their children are young? Again, certainly if they're poor, they should. And all of these conversations affect individual women. They affect their families. They affect their communities, and they affect their societies. But critically, they also affect their kids. So when women were starting to join the workforce, actually long after Alice and Lois joined the workforce, but in the 70s and 80s, when women were starting to join the workforce in the US sort of en masse, and it was happening in much of Europe at this time as well, there were some studies that showed that adolescents that were raised by women that were employed had more egalitarian gender attitudes. I'll talk some more about that. And they were in some ways more ambitious, especially women, or especially girls, teenage girls. As women really moved into the workforce, the tone of that research started to change. And the research question started to be, well, what about the little kids? And so this research turned to, like, what's the adjustment of a 3-year-old when her mother goes to work? We're getting some adjustments on the sound system. Is that working better?
Camera, sorry.
Oh, camera, okay. What's the effect on a 4-year-old when a mother is employed? And I turn that question to a much larger question. That's what's the effect on these children, their lives taken much, much more broadly. So I'm going to look at the effect on adults, and I'm going to look at the effect on whether girls are even brought into society. I'm not going to talk about working moms. So I was raised by a very, very hardworking mom who raised 5 of us. She was never paid for what she did. She volunteered in more ways than you can imagine. This unpaid employment that women engage in actually isn't a source of debate. It probably should be. And I think some of you and your colleagues question what the value of this is and how we can value it more deeply in society. But that's not the point of the debate. The point of the debate is paid employment. So I'm going to talk about employed moms, employed women. Again, I might every once in a while skip into working moms, but again, moms work. So the question that I'm going to ask is, how does women's employment alongside men's affect the lives of girls and boys in the next generation? It's a really broad question. I'm going to present 4 really broad studies that provide some very specific and positive and sometimes sobering answers to this question. So let's start with men's employment. So we don't ask, is men's employment good for their children? In fact, the question, to the extent that it's studied at all, is men's unemployment harmful for children? We take it for granted that men's employment is good for children, in fact, necessary for children. What we don't take for granted and what we leave unquestioned is the foundation on which men's employment rests. And this is a quote from 1988, but it remains in the sort of ethosphere, that men's employment balances precariously on the notion that women help rather than work, that women's true place is in the home, and that when they're out there working, they're doing things that closely resemble what it is they would do at home. They help at work. And there's a lot of research in organizations of the helping roles, the saving roles that women do within organizations. And I want to highlight this assumption because it's left unquestioned. So rather than saying, how does women's employment harm children? I think we should ask, how does men's and women's employment affect their children's lives? So I'm going to lay out some sort of organizing propositions for this discussion. And the first one has to do with the realms in which, you can't quite see that in the classroom, the realms in which women's employment occurs. It occurs in two realms. The first, as we would assume, is a financial realm. So women get paid for what they do. That's paid employment is what we're studying. They tend to get paid less than what men get paid, or essentially the same jobs. They are in different types of jobs than men are in, and they tend to be lower paying jobs. And they tend to spend that income more on their family than the same earning man would spend on their family. And importantly, these earnings aggregate up. So a woman's earnings come to the woman, but they also go to the family, they go to the community, and they go to society. So this is the big push for women's employment, right? Much of the rise in GDP across the last 20 years has been, across the last 50 years, has been due to women joining the workforce. So there's some aggregation of good that's definitely going on, and we're going to really examine it within the family. Women's employment also occurs within a normative realm. And that is that women's work has, think about this very locally, not like Ithaca locally, but like US locally, and even sort of pockets of US locally, define what's sort of okay for women to do. And if you move to Norway, you'd find a different set. If you move to southern China, you'd find a different set. If you move to India, you would find a different set. So women's employment is prescribed very locally about what's okay and what's taboo. And it exists within this normative realm where women are expected in most, again, most local settings, not just to be employed outside the home, but also be able to manage the home, to take care of everything going on at home, to cook delicious meals, to take care of the baby, and to keep a clean house. So that's all within this sort of normative realm of where women's work occurs. The second part of this proposition is that women's employment isn't a singular thing. There are different types of women's employment. Lots and lots of you study types of occupations. And I'm going to throw occupations for women into two categories. One is traditional. And you can think of traditional work as having two primary features. One is that it tends to pay less. Women's work is work that's been relegated to women, tends to pay less. As men come in, it tends to start paying more. And it's essentially historically accepted within the gendered social order. So it's quite okay for women to be teachers and nurses, child care providers, again, within this local context. And in other contexts, it's quite okay for women to be engaged in agricultural work. It might be okay in some settings for women to be engaged in some sort of interaction with other women, but it is, you think of traditional work as that which is okay within the gendered social order. It doesn't challenge that status quo. Non-traditional employment, you can think of as the flip side. That is, that there is at least a potential to reap greater financial rewards, and it challenges in some way that gendered social order. You can think about it challenging in multiple ways. It could be that women are doing things that they're sort of not supposed to do. They could be pushing in on men's territory, or they could be just like not leaving enough time to take care of what they have to take care of at home. So it upsets that gendered social order. These two propositions are going to be foundational for all the research that I'm going to talk about. So with that prelude, let me tell you what we'll talk about today. And let me stop for a moment here and say, just raise your hand anytime. And as I think Pam has those who are on Zoom. So those in Zoom sort of do that little mechanical, cute little hand that shows up next to your face. And Pam will call on you. Anyone in the room, I'll call on you, and I encourage someone to get that started, because if you don't, everybody's behind their little masks and on their little Zoom screen, and nobody will say anything for an hour and a half, and you're going to be bored to tears. So yes,
You have a question?
Thanks so much. I just have an early one. I'm wondering if you can go back to the other slide very quickly. The earlier one.
Which one?
Just the one you were on before this one. Yeah.
Yep.
Can you say a little bit more about why you assume that traditional employment is going to bring limited financial resources, why those two are aligned? I can think of possible examples where the traditional employment would probably bring greater financial resources, but I'm not sure. I just wanted to.
Yeah, great question. So first of all, it's probabilistic, right? So, but second of all, there's lots of research that shows that women get paid less, are in lower paying employment. So things that are like teachers, like if you think about what it is we ask teachers to do in the classroom, as all of us who are parents have been exposed to very sort of baldly over the last couple of years, the skill set that requires is worth so much more money than we pay, but that's a historically female job. It's a job that women have been in for centuries, and it still doesn't pay very well. So statistically, again, this is probabilistic. Feminine jobs do tend to pay less. I'm going to talk, my second set of studies is in India, and there we literally looked at how much the women earned, and those that were in traditional work earned substantially less than those, again, probabilistically, but there are very, very big differences. But it's a great question. It wouldn't have to be that way, right? You can imagine that it could be traditional for women. What would be a high-paying traditional women's job? What were you thinking?
I don't know, what was I thinking?
It's actually hard to come up with one.
Women doctors, aren't women doctors or not?
There are women doctors. My daughter's on her way to being a women doctor, but that is not traditional. And as any female in med school or in the medical profession will tell you, it's definitely not traditional. There have become some practices like OBGYN that now employ not primarily, but majority women, and they pay less.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm
Even-
totally
even
unfamiliar
doctors.
with this research. That's why I was asking.
Yeah,
But
Yeah,
thank
it's
you.
a really, really good question.
Okay, thank you.
So when you say traditional research, you mean female-dominated occupations? Is that kind of equivalent? Yes, you could say that. So historically female-dominated occupations, in the sense that at a time when we had even less sort of openness to women being employed, it was still okay for them to do that. Okay. Teachers and nurses are the sort of stereotypical. So the plan for today is for me to talk about two different papers, each with two studies. One looks at mothers' employment in 29 countries, primarily North America and Europe, a few outside. I'll say more about that. And the question we ask there is for the adult sons and daughters of women who were employed when their kids were children, relative to the adult sons and daughters of women who stayed at home full time, what's the effect on their employment choices, outcomes? We could debate whether it's an outcome or a choice, but whether they're employed and their employment status, and their domestic choices or outcomes, the amount of time they spend on housework, the amount of time they spend with their families. And if they differ, then why? So that's what we're going to look at in the first study. And in the second study, we're going to move to this. So it's very, very difficult to think about how to study women's employment and conceptually to understand women's employment, as long as you accept that it's within this gendered social order, without also thinking about men's employment. But this first study is really not going to spend much time on men's employment except for controlling for the household income. The second study is going to go right into sort of men's and women's employment together. The other difference is here we're going to look at individual level outcomes. And I've been talking about these outcomes affecting children, affecting families, affecting communities, affecting society. So in the second study, we'll move up levels of analysis, as we say in academics, sort of from the individual level to the family level and then to the community level. And then I'll step back and say, so what? What do we find and what is this going to tell us? Oh. So this is the first study. It's called Learning from Mom. We cross-national evidence linking maternal employment and adult children's outcomes. And this is work with
Mara Ruiz Castro, and Elizabeth Long-Lingo. And what we did is we looked at census data. So there are organizations, and those of you who are engaged, students who are engaged in research and want to do archival research, there in almost all countries, there are additions to census. And each year it's some kind of different addition. And we used addition to census data that looked at gender attitudes and cross-generational effects of gender attitudes. So we grabbed the data on about 50,000 working age, so 18 to 60 years old, women and men. Really importantly, and I'll go into this a little bit more, we replicated it across 2 samples. So these are cross-sectional data, so it's really hard to say, to sort of weed everything out with just cross-sectional data. So we'll try to do that with the data. And you can see the list of countries. So there are a few that aren't in Europe or North America. There's Taiwan, there's Russia, there's the Philippines, but for the most part, these are, there's Israel, but these are European and North America for the most part. So we have this really blunt measure of maternal employment. It varies across the 2 studies, which is good. So we can see whether it matters what the measure is. But we're going to use first just a 0-1 measure. So this dichotomous measure, the question in the survey is, did your mother ever work for pay as long as 1 year outside the home before you were 14? So that's the question in the ISSP. The second, which was only 21 of the 29 countries, is what was your mother's occupation when you were 15 years old? So you can come up with all the differences between these measures. We turn this into a dichotomous measure. If it said unemployed or housewife or homemaker, we made that a 0. Everything else was a 1. And then we used the much finer data in here to try to get at some questions of causality. There's a nice range across the countries. So Mexico had the lowest, 35% of the women in the year that was collected were engaged in paid employment. Czech Republic, and in fact, almost all the Soviet bloc countries were the highest employment levels for women. I see lots of nodding. Yep, that's what you would expect. Yes.
Yeah, so is the sample mostly about dual income family, or does that include the single mother who is employed?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It includes, so these are the children that are being surveyed. There's actually no screen whatsoever for anything about their mother. So we have low income mothers, we have high income mothers, we have middle income mothers, we have single mothers, we have older mothers, we have younger mothers, we have all of that. We control for the respondent's marital status. We don't have the mother's marital status. And I think it's vitally important we don't have it. How and why might mom's employment matter? So the how, we're going to look at whether employed moms affect the likelihood of employment, like are you or aren't you? Whether you hold supervisory responsibility, how many hours you spend in paid employment, and your overall earnings, annual income. And this is across 29 countries, so it's normalized and standardized in all of those things for the statisticians in the room. We're also going to look at domestic outcomes. So the hours you spend, this is per week in household work, the hours you spend per week in family care. This is an aggregation of a whole bunch of different tasks that sort of hang together very nicely in a factor analysis. So that's what we're looking at. This question of why might it matter? So it might matter because of gender attitudes. Remember I told you the early research suggested that being raised, at least teenagers, raised by an employed mom tended to have more egalitarian gender attitudes. So it might go through gender attitudes. It might be, again, if we get anything, which we do, or I wouldn't be here, but so it might be that having an employed mom affects your gender attitudes, and then your gender attitudes affect whether you decide to work or not, and affect how you interact with your own family when you're an adult. It might also be that you sort of learn the tricks of the trade, right? So It is different, as all employed moms know, sort of working and taking care of a household. Those are sort of juggling that all together, especially if you're a single mom, takes some skill. So it might just be social learning. So if I was raised by a mom who was doing this, I might just know how to do it better, and therefore I'm more successful at it. So we're going to look at both of those mechanisms. So think first about gender attitudes. So these are the beliefs about what's appropriate. What's appropriate in terms of what you think and believe, and what's appropriate in terms of what you do. And we're going to sort of do a stretch between traditional and egalitarian with those at the ends of the continuum. This is actually based on the number of questions in the survey differ, but somewhere between 12 and 20 questions about gender attitudes. And this is a very standard block of questions that's used over and over and over and over and over and over, even to the point of where they're not updated in ways that actually even make sense in some ways now. So they need some updating, but those are the questions. And so a traditional person would answer a question like, men should be breadwinners and women should be at home. You know, on a 1 to 7 scale, disagree, agree. And they would agree with that. And egalitarian are people who believe that in a question would say, men and women should share housework. Fully agree. So a fully egalitarian person thinks opportunities, choices, and sort of rewards for men and women should be exactly the same at work and at home. Traditional thinks, and here traditional is very much men should be out in the public sphere earning, and women should be at home taking care of things. And this is a continuum. So I'll show you what we found, and this is across the countries. Now, I'm revealing all here, but let me start by saying, essentially every piece of research on gender attitudes shows that men have more traditional gender attitudes than women do. There's lots of reasons provided for this. One of it is just self-interest. So if one of them says women's choices are limited and one of them says women's choices are everything, then women would be sort of self-interested to do that. The other is this idea that there is, if I believe this, then I open up opportunities for myself. So to the extent that I'm actually working, I have to hold more gender egalitarian attitudes to sort of justify who it is I am and what it is I do. So women essentially always have more egalitarian gender attitudes than men. But look at this. These are women raised by moms who stayed at home full time. They have substantially more traditional gender attitudes than men raised by moms who were employed. Ella.
Yes, just a technical question, a
Yeah.
statistical question. How old or what's the range of age of your sample?
Yep.
This has to do with how many of these people grew up with Eastern Europe being Eastern Europe.
Yep, great question. So they're 18 to 60. And so thank you for asking. Let me tell you about the controls. So we control for age squared, because age is one of these, as those of us who are doing the squared part now. So we control for age and age squared. We control for the country in which they were raised. We control for their own marital status. We control for whether they have children at home. We control for in one of them, we control for their father's employment. We don't have the parents' marital status. So we're controlling for as much as we can. We have fixed effects at the country level. We sort of cluster around the country level. But you're exactly right that the country, the society in which you grew up and how many people around you, how many women around you were employed at that time matters a lot. And if I don't get back to it in 2 slides, remind me to come back to it because it's part of our sort of guess around social learning. So it turns out to be a really important question. Okay, so what did we find? So let's look first in the workplace and first just at women. So daughters of women who were employed outside the home, relative to daughters who were raised by stay-at-home mom, me, are more likely to be employed. They are more likely to supervise others. They are spending more time at work each week, and controlling for how much time they spend at work. They have higher annual earnings. These asterisks, which look pretty small here, which are on employed, which people in the room can't see, as well as time and earnings, are all at least partially mediated. In fact, employed is almost fully mediated by gender attitudes. So if you think about that path we drew, if you don't have gender attitudes in the equation, you get this really strong effect from maternal employment. Once you put gender attitudes into that equation, that effect from maternal employment gets much, much smaller. For employment itself, it goes essentially away. And for these, it remains significant, but significant at a much lower level. And I see hands all over the place. So let me start with Alice and go to you, and then to Rose. Yes.
Do you find any relation between the mother's occupation and the daughter's? Maybe like traditional, non-traditional type jobs or other type of categorizations you can do of job types?
Yep. So it's a great question. What we find, so we don't ask it exactly in type. The respondents don't say the type of employment they're engaged in, they say their income. So we don't have the type. We do have, for the smaller sample, the mother's type. So what we find, and this is part of our sort of social learning, we think. What we do find is that for, we split it by socioeconomics. And it basically breaks down into essentially manual labor, low skill non-manual labor, and high skill non-manual labor. Those are very gross categories, but those are the categories we're working with. And what we find is that employment itself, it doesn't matter. Hours per week and higher earnings, those tend to go, hours per week tends to go with the lower income moms. So this is strongest for moms who essentially were sort of scraping by. These two are driven more by the two higher categories. So non-manual, low skill labor and high skill labor. So there does tend to be socioeconomic effects. Other studies have, so there's lots of research that shows that boys do what their dads do. Early research is starting to show the same thing is true for girls and their moms, but we didn't study that question. It's a great question. Over here.
Yeah, I was wondering when, like the way we're categorizing employment, does that include like entrepreneurship at all? So if these women are owning their own businesses or are working, because I could see if they're working for their husband, then like, does that actually, would that have the same sort of, I guess, gender attitude change, or would it just be another helping role that's sort of an extension of the home?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer it differently for the two data sets. In the data set where they said, what was your mom's employment? That's one of the categories. They can say, what was your mom doing when she was 15 years old? You can say she was an entrepreneur, she was working in a company with my dad. Those would all be counted as high skill. Well, yeah, because we're saying what kind of job it was, they would have been counted as high skill employed. The ISSP said, did your mom ever work for pay outside the home for as much as a year? So it depends on what the kids think, right? So if I interpret that as a kid is like, my mom's doing the books for my dad, but she's home full time, and I don't actually, I mean, she's just like sitting at whatever she sits there and does, and I don't sort of translate that as employment, it would show up as a no. Which these are really, really noisy measures. So I think most kids would, I don't know what most kids would say, but that's the data that we have. And Rose.
Oh, so I was picking up on Tova. I know you said this, but I'm trying to get a sense of historical context.
Yeah.
So you said you've got 18 to 64-year-olds I thought I saw 2001 to 2013 early on. So are these surveys from different countries that happened sometime in that period and they're cross-sectional and then you brought them together?
Exactly.
And so then, so it could be that you're surveying as someone who's 64 in 2001 who grew up in, you know, Lithuania under the Soviet Union versus, right? So,
Yep, exactly.
okay.
Yep. So we're gonna, you guys really want me to tell you about this analysis, so I'm going to. So we thought this was a really cool piece of the data. So we know when they grew up and we know where they grew up. And thanks to Kayla and Hammer, Door, we know the rate of female employment when they were 14 years old in the country that they were living in when they were 14 years old. So we took this and we said, if this is about social learning, then for women who grew up in places where there were lots of employed moms around them, I mean, like, it's gone, but like if 95% of women were working and your mom wasn't, like, is it really going to affect your gender attitudes? I don't know, but it turns out it doesn't, right? So the effects are they don't go away, but the effects are weakened. So they're negative related to this sort of proportion of women in the workforce where you lived when you were 14, which suggests there's a strong social learning effect. I'm going to move to at home and tell you how that flipped in a kind of interesting way for at home. There was another question back here.
Oh, actually, I was going to ask a question about whether you see different effect across countries. So I wonder if the woman's employment matters more for the kids' outcome in countries with more traditional gender norms. And how does that compare to countries with more egalitarian gender norms?
Yep. So your intuition is exactly right.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah,
It
maybe we'll have
matters.
the data in the next
Yep.
few slides.
Yep. Your individual experience at home matters more the more distant it is from, and that's not reported in the paper, but we did a whole bunch of things like, there's a whole bunch of measures of egalitarianism at the country level. We get the same thing, but we had this really nice, precise measure of the year you were 14 and the rate of female labor force participation at the time. So we use that measure instead. If you go with sort of the gender norms, and those didn't tend to be measured back, so we can't go back to when some of our respondents were 14, but generally if you just sort of use a hammer and throw in the gender norms at the time that we were doing the analyses, you get roughly the same effects. So your intuition is exactly right. What your mom does matters more if it's more different from what you see around you. Another question, then I'm going to move on. Yep.
Okay, maybe this is irrelevant to your topic, but as a male in the room, I'm curious about whether gender attitude matters for men too. Like in the
Yes.
prior slide, you showed the male-female differences. Here, I think you're focusing more on the female side.
Yes,
So
thank you. So it doesn't matter for boys at all. So and it doesn't matter at home. So I'll go into home in a minute. But one of the big pushbacks we got when we originally started talking about this data was, well, this is just women bring earnings into the household. Women who were employed are also more educated. Households with more education and more earnings are going to have children who are employed, who supervise others, who work more, who earn more. Doesn't matter at all for the guys. At all, zero, nothing. It's not good, it's not bad, it's nada. Like this is statistically zero. And so you'd have to come up with this story about how somehow the household is shaping the girls' choices, but not shaping the boys' choices, and it's not about gender. It's kind of hard to do. But we also did a bunch of other checks to try to get at this. So in the second data set, we have the type of employment, which I've already talked about. And we also have mother's education and father's education. And something about the earnings of the father. I can remember exactly what that measure was. So we put all of those in.
Education doesn't act like this. So education does affect earnings, but education doesn't affect women's employment in this way. What both employment and education do is they affect boys and girls' education. So employed moms, boys have higher education, daughters have higher education. More educated moms, boys have more education, girls have more education. But it is women's, and this goes back to this question of, are women doing what their moms are doing? Boys are probably doing what their dads are doing, and we don't have that measure here. So yes, Pam.
Sorry, I don't want to hang you up. There is a question from the cyberspace
Thank you, cyberspace person.
about the gender. I think it involves the measure of gender role attitudes. And the question is, can you speak at all to the differences in attitudes of men towards their wives' roles versus their daughters? So women should work should stay at home, might have one meaning vis-a-vis your wife and a different meaning vis-a-vis your daughter. I think that's the nature of the question.
Yeah.
So let me speak to what I can speak to from our data, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what the literature is saying. We find that sons of moms who were employed outside the home are, and others have found this as well, Fernandez et al. Found this, are significantly more likely to be married to women who are also employed outside the home. So when we look at all the effects for guys, we have to control for whether they're married to a working woman who's employed or not. So in terms of their choices, it looks like more egalitarian men are very happy to marry, so have it be both their spouses and their daughters. There is some, I think of it as like, well, I won't put my judgment on it. There is some research out there that suggests that when CEOs have daughters, they all of a sudden become more egalitarian, as if they weren't married to women, and most of them are. So it sort of confuses me. I don't understand why they can make that leap with their daughters, but they can't make it with their wives. But there is some literature suggesting that that's the case. Right. Okay, I'll try to stop editorializing and I'll move on. So now we're going to go home, and at home, sons and daughters see the effects of their mom's employment. So men who were raised by moms who were employed spend about an hour more a week caring for family members. And an hour doesn't seem like very much until you see the number of hours that men spend caring for family members. And this doesn't quite double it, but it's close, right? So it is a big effect. And women spend about an hour or less a week on housework. Now, we don't know whether there's no effect for women on spending time with their families. And there's no effect for men on housework. So we don't know whether this is because they're hiring somebody or whether they're just not doing it. Or whether their kids are doing it. We get more egalitarian kids, but nonetheless, women are spending less time on housework. Men are spending more time with their children. So it really is affecting not just the individual, but their families, but we'll dig into that a little bit more. One of the, I was going to bring back this whole idea of, the year by where they were raised to try to get at this social learning outside. For men, it goes the other way. So the effect for maternal employment on men spending time with their family is increased. It's positively interacts with the role models outside. It seems like you need that double whammy. Not only is it okay at home, it's okay in society, and therefore I'll do it. With women, it's the opposite. It's sort of like one or the other seems to work, but with men, they need it both. And both of these are mediated by gender attitudes. All right, so I've been talking about these reverberations in households and communities, and I've been talking a lot about what men get or they don't get, but haven't been talking much about men's employment. So I'm going to move to a study where we
move up these levels of analysis and where we bring men's employment into the equation. So we want to look at men's and women's employment simultaneously because men and women engage in employment and at home in ways that are really intertwined. Some ways that are quite cooperative, some ways that are quite competitive, but to think about sort of women's employment without thinking about men's employment is to miss effects at the family level, at the social level. So if we, so Becker had in 1981, a sociologist, he had this model of the household. And this model of the household is that this is a monolithic entity. I'm sure all of you guys live in households exactly like this, where everyone agrees on the goals and everyone puts in sort of what their capacity is, and then we make choices about who should be employed and who should stay at home and who should get resources and who should control those resources, because we're all in this together for the good of the whole. That's the way my family is. That's the way all your families are. But it turns out that in lots of ways, men and women do engage in real sort of collaborative, cooperative, like we're holding the status quo together. There are sort of frays at the edges for both men and women, but this isn't just something women are engaging in the labor market on their own. And so if you think about how men's employment might play into this, as when men are in really strong employment settings, this might reinforce the status quo. Like we don't need women's finance so much, and they can sort of control the gendered social order because they control the positions of power. When men's employment is falling, the opposite might happen. And so we want to look at these rises and falls in men's employment and see whether that has any implications for the effects of women's employment. All right, so now I'm going to move to a study, two studies in India that we call Breaking from Tradition. And this is with my colleague, Alexandra Feldberg. And we are in the throes of the revise and resubmit on this article. So any input now or later would be very welcome. So we have two large data sets, and we collected some data of our own, which we're still analyzing. So I won't talk about the data that we collected on our own. This is the first data set is panel data. So data collected every 10 years, 1981, 91, 2001, 2011. I don't know why that says 2012, but that's my typo. So we have 4 panels of data. We're going to distinguish between traditional and non-traditional work along the lines that I talked about, but I'll define it even further in India. We're also going to measure men's employment, most specifically changes in men's employment, but we'll look at this in the second data set is cross-sectional at the household level. We'll look at that as well. And then we're going to look at a very stark measure of the value of girls. And this is the female sex ratio. In most countries in the world, the female sex ratio, that is the number of girls relative to the number of boys, or the number of women relative to the number of men. You can take this at different ages, and it varies a bit depending on age. Women tend to live longer. But just for most of the world, it's kind of 50-50. Boys are a teeny bit stronger at birth to make up for sort of changes over life, but nonetheless, basically in most countries, this is 50-50. Notably, in some countries, it isn't close to 50-50. India and China are two of the countries where it deviates quite drastically from 50-50. Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, and others have called this the missing women problem. And it is millions and millions of girls and women. So this is a very stark measure, but this is going to be the measure we use of the value placed on girls in the next generation. So we're going to look at traditional and non-traditional employment, and specifically in India. So this is back to the wages. So same in the wages, and here we actually measure how much they're earning. So we know that. In India, traditional work for women, this study, we're going to focus on women living in villages. The reasons for that will become clear in a minute. But even for women living in the city, traditional work is basically close to home, sometimes even in home, like women aren't allowed to leave the home. In villages, the rural villages that we'll be looking at, it's in the fields, it's in the village center, it's inside the home. Part of the reason that this is traditional is that it maintains the separation. So women are not in the public sphere, they're in the private sphere, they're in their home. The men they're exposed to are the men that are in their family. But it also allows women to take their kids with them. So women working in the fields have their children with them. I don't think this is actually a picture that I took, but it could be a picture I took. We visited some villages and spent some time with women who were doing home-based work in the village, and their kids are just right there with them. And this allowance so that women can means that women do take care of everything at the household. And this includes things like, walking for hours to get water and things like that. So this is traditional work at the village level in India. And there's a question there, yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, could you say whether this study captures work in the informal sector?
Yes, so the answer is yes. So this is data that's collected by the government. It's the national census. So they actually look at any earnings, period. So informal, formal. We do some separation. So they have different terms for them. So we put them together. Sometimes we take them apart. So the robustness checks in the study go on and on and on. Tends not to make a difference, but think basically most of this is informal work and most of this is formal work. It's not 100%, but that's largely true. Most of this doesn't have sort of employers per se.
Okay, yeah, no, I was thinking about like work that women do in other people's households. And so how that squares with allowing for maintaining full responsibility for childcare and other tasks. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, so another very good question. In the second study, those women will come into our data set. In this study, these are very poor villages. These women are not hiring. They're not helping in other people's homes because they don't, by and large, they don't leave their village. There might be some women in here that would be working in other people's homes that would end up being in here because it would be service-based work.
Okay.
And so we have the DHS, which is think about it, sort of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We use their categorizations. So that work would go in here because it would be called service work. It probably, you could think of it as traditional, except that it takes people away from home. So if you thought of this as a 2x2, it wouldn't be perfect, right? Because that's very, very low wage work.
Yeah, market work is that male dominated in India? I mean, so selling in the market, I mean, that's a place where you're in public, but you can easily bring your kids. I know in Latin America, it's usually women, but I actually don't know about India.
Yep. So if it is selling agricultural goods,
yeah,
it would be here and they would be selling in their own villages. So they're not like transporting from village to village by and large.
So they're not going to a market center.
There might be a market center, but it would be a market center.
Like a regional.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do is we look at the proximity to larger cities. So Ahmedabad, this is in Gujarat, which I'll get to in a second, which is one of the states in India. So we look at proximity to Ahmedabad. There are some other very, very big cities in Gujarat as well. And it seems to be that there's something going on there, which might mean there's a little more transportation. We're trying to figure out if we can get a geolocation variable that we can put in. It's not in there now. So we're not controlling for that, and there's probably some noisiness around that. Non-traditional work, I think we've talked about most of these things because they're just sort of the flip of this. But importantly, in our data set, non-traditional work between 1981 and 2011 increased fourfold. So it's still a very small proportion. Most of the women in these villages are engaging in traditional work, but it is a growing sector. So this is the sex ratio. This is the total population, the black line. I think I probably look at that. This is, as you can see, it's falling, meaning there are fewer females per 1,000 males. So it starts at 980. So it doesn't even start at equal and goes down to about 900. So this is the number of females per 1,000 males. And this is the year that the census data were collected. It's unclear to me and to lots of scholars why this is rising here, but it's certainly not rising because of birth. So this is children under 7, and you can see this very steep line. They didn't start collecting that data until much later, but you can see this very steep line. This is a result of sex-selective abortions and restrictions of food, restrictions of vaccine, and things like that, restrictions of access to healthcare when children are little. These are, again, very poor households. They're making choices. They're ugly choices. I mean, we're gonna, but they're choices that make sense in the gendered social sphere in which they exist. So we're gonna look at why and whether women's employment and men's employment might be underlying some of this. Yep.
Just about the data you showed in the prior slide, I'm wondering if that's just that could be partly a reporting problem, like in some poor communities, they selectively report if they have, let's say, like 5 kids, but they are reporting to the government that they have about 2 or 3 kids for several reasons.
Yeah, so for China, that might be the case.
Yeah,
for
yeah.
India, there's no restriction on children.
Oh, there's
No restriction, never has been. And the number of children per household in the data that we were looking at vary from 0 to 17. So there's just, it definitely could be a reporting problem in parts of China. In India, it's very unlikely. But there's no doubt that census data it's self-reported data. So there might be some things, but it would be hard to explain this. Again, in China, you actually might sort of see something very, very different because of the restrictions, which they're easing, but nonetheless were present for a long time. So we're going to look at a somewhat different model here. We're going to say, when we look at the rate of women's employment, because now we have panel data, so we're looking at changes in the rate of women's employment and the traditionality, this sort of 1-0 measure of women's employment. How does that affect, in the end, this relative status of girls in the next generation? And does that work through what's going on in the household? We'll look at this in study 2. And then we'll ask in both studies, does the rate of men's employment and the status of men's employment affect that? So right now we're using a pretty rough measure of status of women's employment. That's the data that we just finished collecting. We went to, we hired Pratham. Anybody who works in India, they did a fantastic job collecting survey data. They went out into villages and asked people, what is the social standing? They translated it into multiple languages and things. What's the social standing of in all of these different jobs? So we have yet to incorporate that in. We're using a very rough measure of status, sort of along the lines that you and I would use, which may or may not be representative of exactly what they believe. Yes.
This might be related to the status piece, but I wonder, depending on the unemployment, if unemployment might affect more like masculine, like stereotypically masculine jobs. You think of like in North America with like all like the manufacturing jobs, mining jobs, that's where like the big unemployment is, and those would kind of fit the stereotype of masculine jobs. And so I wonder if like where the unemployment's happening might also affect how that like moderation relationship.
Where, meaning in what sector?
Yeah, like I guess
Yeah.
like sectors that might be considered more like traditionally masculine versus
Yeah.
less traditionally masculine.
Yeah, so is your, this is something we've been playing with. Is your intuition that we should look at traditionality of men's employment? It's a much fuzzier concept.
Like in a like a little bit, because I do think like or at least I would imagine it's really closely related to the gender norms. So maybe that's just me stereotyping, but I think of like more men who are in more traditionally masculine jobs might hold stronger gender norms. And so if there's larger unemployment, that might, maybe that would lead to like a larger change in these views of gender norms, or maybe regress. I don't know which direction that would go in, but.
Yeah, it's interesting. We can look at that. We, along with social standing, we are collecting how traditional people think these are. So we can play with that. We sort of had thought we weren't going to use it, but well, we can look into it. So I don't know the answer right now. So our first study, as I alluded to earlier, is in Gujarat, which is, as you can see, a state in the western part of India. It's right up next to Pakistan. It's this is where Modi is from. It's a very varied state. Some of it is actually quite heavy industry relating to what you're saying. And much of this area up here is very, very much desert. The agricultural work, some of the agricultural work that is highest paying there is collecting salt, which is simply from evaporation. So there's a lot of variation. We exclude anything that has more than 5,000 people. And again, we're trying to figure out whether we can do some kind of geolocation to try to get distance from Ahmedabad, which is the capital, which is here, which is a wonderful city to visit if you guys are in the mood. So we have about 17,000 rural villages across that continue across the 4 panels. I just want to do a shout out here for our India Research Center. So 1981 was handwritten in Gujarati. So we translated it first from Gujarati to Hindi, from Hindi onto spreadsheets. 91 was handwritten, but it was in Hindi, so we could at least translate it into the spreadsheets. And then 2001 and 2011 were actually, they were in spreadsheets, not, I wouldn't say digitized exactly, but Ali Feldberg, who's my co-author in the India, she was a student at the time. She now has tenure, no, she's in her 2nd year, but it was an incredible amount of work that she and the India Research Center went through to actually put these data into a data set, trying to see whether a village that has the name written in Gujarati is the same as a village that now has the name written in Hindi, is the same as a village that now has the name typed in Hindi. But we've done backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. So we're pretty confident that these are actually the same 17,000 villages across the 4 times. Really importantly, not partially we're looking because rural, we can really tag onto what's traditional work. But it's also because what we're looking at is the community level. So we're trying to see, does sort of normative pressure affect what choices families are making. So you can think about the small towns around Ithaca as being much more sort of singular in their say gender attitudes, and Ithaca being perhaps more diverse. And then you go to New York City and it would be very, very diverse. So you wouldn't expect the same kind of passage of norms to happen in New York City across the whole city as you would in a small town outside Ithaca. And so we're going to look at these small towns. And this is a complete summation of all of our results. So let me tell you what we have here. So we have the sex ratio here. These are what we call the marginal effects. So for those of you who aren't, I have no idea what the demographics of this group is. So I'm just, so if, in case there are folks who haven't taken a bunch of stats classes. So these are marginal effects after, these are fixed effect data. So we control at the village level. We control for year, of course, we control their panels. So we're looking for sort of change over year. The fixed effects basically say, okay, let's take everything that happened in village X and fix it at 1981. So we're only going to look at changes from 1981 to sort of deal with all of the really important differences across villages. And then we control for everything else we can that's in the census. So the sort of aggregate income of the village, how far it is from a hospital, things like whether there's bus service, the proportion of the population that is that are of unscheduled tribes, the proportion of population across different castes. We control for religion, proportion of the village with different religions, et cetera. So these are the effects after we control for all of that. And so this is the sex ratio of 47 girls to 50 boys, 48 girls to 50 boys. And as you can see, we'll look first at traditional employment. So this is a change, a 15% increase change over a decade. This is a 30% increase. This is a 45% increase. And the question is, as women's traditional employment within a village goes up, what's the effect on the sex ratio? And as you can see, it's positive. Right? So as more women become employed in traditional work, more girls make it to 7 years old. These lines, you may be asking, since I'm standing right in front of the legend that would allow you to understand it, these lines are about men's employment. So this is at the highest level of men's employment, a standard deviation above the mean. This is everything within the standard deviation mean, and this is a standard deviation below the mean. And so what we can see is for traditional employment, men's employment matters as a main effect. So you can see this when men are engaged in sort of, when men are more highly employed, this is change as well. This isn't type of employment. So when men's employment is going up, the effect for women's employment is lower, but it's just additive. It's not like there's some interaction effect. That's different for non-traditional employment. So what you see here, if you were just looking at the main effect, if you can see these lines, what you'd see is a slight positive effect, marginally significant in some models, again, with various things. But when we put in men's employment, we see a really starkly different effect. That is, for villages where men's employment is going up, if women's employment and non-traditional employment is going up, there is a disruption of the social order and fewer girl babies make it to 7 years old. And the opposite is when men's earnings are going down. So we can see this is a very stark picture of why it's really important to think about men's employment and women's employment together. So how do you make sense of this? This is at the community level. So the very astute review. So we just submitted the study with just the first study first. And the very astute reviewers at AJS said, well, what's going on? So that's why we had to collect a whole bunch of data at the household level to explain what's going on. So study 2 examines this at the household level. And we're going to consider 2 different reasons. It might be that men's and women's employment taken together is affecting preferences. And so the question they ask is, what's the ideal number of girls? So it might, and again, this is different, very different than China, where you basically say, do you want a boy or a girl? This is just ideal number, because you can have as many kids as you want. Or it might affect practices. And for practices, we look at this combined measure of women's voice in decision-making. So is the practice in the household that women have voice, or that men get to make the decisions? And 4,400 households, We have lots of controls. Oh, really importantly, these data are collected from the man and the woman in the same household, 4,400 households collected separately. This is very labor-intensive data collection. We didn't do it. This is cross-sectional data collected sort of spanning 2 years between 2005 and 2006. It's across the country. I'm going to do a gross summary of what we found here. And that is that there's a positive and significant relationship between women's employment and their voice in decision-making. And that's moderated, meaning the higher status men's employment, the sort of dampening effect of women's employment on voice. And there is a positive effect, and that's what's shown here between these. This is women's voice in decision-making, so egalitarian. So the more women have a voice in decision-making, the more egalitarian the gender practices, the higher the sex ratio within the household. So to be honest, I thought this was a fool's game when Ali said, let's collect household level data. Like, you cannot get sex ratio outcomes at the household level. People just don't have enough kids. But it turns out you can. So what happens is that when women are employed, they have more voice in household decisions. Women's voice in household decisions affects the number of girls that are born. And this is one of the worst things that was ever invented in statistics, moderated mediation, which means that these positive effects for these egalitarian practices, which is the mediation, are moderated by, they're dampened when men are in high status roles. So this is quite, I won't show you the rest of the analyses, but this is the really simple finding, that when women have more voice, the status of girls in the next generation goes up. So we find this, that the traditionality affects status, that it's moderated by men's work, and that this is mediated, here's the moderated mediation, mediated by these egalitarian practices. So what does it all mean? So I want to leave you with 4 things. The first time I started talking about the maternal employment work, I was asked to give a talk for about 400 executives and dealers at Caterpillar, all women. And they came up with the idea that I should first interview some of the children of these women, adult children. And I decided to have them be on this panel, and I gave them a series of questions. And one of the questions I asked them is, now as your adult self, knowing what you know, living the life you live, what would you tell your employed mom when you were little? And to a person, they all said, chill out, we're doing fine. So that's my first lesson, that maternal employment is not harming children. Depending on what you think about women's employment, it is making it more likely that women are going to be employed. They have better jobs if they are employed. It means that men are spending more time with their children. So this doesn't mean that women should work, but certainly women shouldn't choose not to work because they think it's going to hurt their children. So that's the first thing that I'll leave you with. The second thing is that men's employment also affects gender equality, that threats to men's status. So as we go about all of this equality building, to the extent that that becomes very threatening to men's status, we see that play out in challenges to women at work and at home, and challenges to the next generation as well. So we want to think about how we can do this in a much more collaborative way. What goes on at home matters as well. In most of the world, women are very slowly and without the same kind of upward trajectory that we saw in the late part of the 20th century. But nonetheless, what's happening at work is becoming more and more egalitarian. Women are moving into more occupations. The very fact that someone would ask, thank you for asking it, isn't being a doctor a traditional women's, like, that's really good news, right? So in the employment sphere, gender equality is like we're eking slowly, but we're eking. That ain't happening at home. And if we want to get to this point in the sort of economic sphere, financial sphere, we have to have more gender equality at home. Because while women's employment sort of leads to greater role in decision-making and higher status for girls, this is moderated by men's employment. And it can only happen in places where men and women are roughly equal in what they do at work and at home. And finally, I'm going to leave you. Allie and I started in April 2020. We decided to do a quick survey of about 1,500 households where there were dual earning couples with children at home during, that short lockdown period. We're now in our third survey and our third round of interviews. And what we're seeing and what you're reading about in the press every day and what we're hearing even in these discussions at Congress is that we are at a turning point. We don't know where we're going to turn. But employment is being questioned. The way we interact at home is being questioned. What it is our children do in terms of their education, where that education happens is being questioned. And we have, I think, lots of people who are much more expert than I would say that we have right now an inflection point that if we take advantage of it, if we inflect in a direction toward equality at home, we can start to hope for true equality across all spheres. I'm gonna stop there. I thank my co-authors, Mayra, Elizabeth, and Allie. And none of this would have been possible without lots of support from Kaylin, from Nina Tobio, and from Katie Chen, as well as the India Research Center. So I just want to open it up.
So we have maybe time for one more question, if there are any. We are pretty close to the witching hour, as it were. Yeah, one more.
Just really quickly, I thought that the research was really, really interesting, but I'm wondering too what other possibly intersectional factors can be counted towards how we think, especially in the differences between families. You were looking at India, for instance, so I'm wondering if maybe you saw some caste differences and how that played out in the end. Or I'm, for instance, more familiar with Latin America, and I would maybe like to think about differences in terms of ethno-racial differences. So maybe I was wondering if you have taken a look at that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So in the India data, the coefficients on scheduled tribes and religion are very strong. So very, very big effects. We don't look at intersectionality per se, so we're not sort of emphasizing that, but definitely we could not look at the effects for women and make any sense out of them if we weren't controlling for the effects of caste and scheduled tribes. So vitally important in those data. The country level data, some of these countries are quite homogeneous. Some, for example, the Nordic countries are quite homogeneous. Some of them are quite heterogeneous. I never thought about this, but I love the idea of going into the data and looking at the amount of heterogeneity in terms of race and seeing whether the country level effects vary with that heterogeneity. That would be a great idea. Somebody should do that. These are publicly available data. So that's a great question. We absolutely see intersectionality with social class. We did not, again, control for the race of the respondent. I actually right now can't remember what those coefficients are, but I could, if you email me, I can tell you. But again, if we didn't control for the race, we would be getting a much noisier measure on women. So the intersectionality is there. we don't emphasize it, but it's certainly critical. And I think it'd be really interesting to look at the national level. That's another sort of, because we look at these little villages, you don't have that same kind of intersectionality within those villages, but we do at the country level data.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is there someone in there? No. I was just wondering, first of all, this is wonderful. This is very enlightening and amazing that you did this study in India where all the challenges
Well,
of doing
to be
that
fair, I
research-
didn't collect, these are
Yeah.
census data, so. Yeah.
But so I'm wondering if, I know this wasn't your focus, but whether you started to unpackage, sub segments that did have different patterns. So you mentioned like different castes. Are there, now you did say that higher status men were suppressing the employment right at the end. But I'm just wondering if there are some salient sub populations that you've started to look at, maybe you haven't had a chance yet. And
Yeah.
also, where you want to go next.
Yeah, so these questions are quite similar in the sense of these subpopulations. You could, because there's so much data, both with the intergenerational study, which is the GTP, and the International Social Studies Program, which is ISSP. Those are the first two studies. There's lots of data. You could definitely sort of hone in on certain population types. You couldn't, the data within country, like there's like, say, 4,000 observations or something within country. There's not enough data in the biggest country. There's not enough data within country, I think, to do those intersectional analyses with those data. But certainly those data are out there. You can get data where you could look at that. And our findings suggest it's really important. The India data, there's plenty of data so that you could dig in and see the effects, look at the effects within caste. In terms of what I'm doing next, the what we call the COVID study, we called it WAX, Work Attitude Change Study, because we thought there was going to be this like little shock to the system. It might change people's attitudes, but instead it just was change the system. So we have so much data there. In fact, if there are doctoral students in the room who are interested in joining us in that study, we have 3 rounds of survey data, 3 rounds of interview data, some diary studies for that. So that's going to take us a couple of years. I'm also, one of the funnest studies I'm working on, I'm mystified. So I'm of the generation where, like, when I came out into the workforce, everything was looking rosy. And even though I was sort of one of the first, I was sort of an executive when I was young. And I remember the CEO of the company offering me a pen on Secretary's Day. And I'm like, but nonetheless, things, kept getting better and better. And then they're kind of flattening off. And so I decided, that it would be a great idea to try to understand the national discourse on this. And so I thought it'd be really easy. I could just collect all of the newspaper articles from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post to get the 3 sort of sectors of society that talk about women's employment from the passage of the Equal Pay Act in 1963. And we could just use natural language processing to look at this. Well, it turns out 2.5 years later, we now have the data. Digitized data are way oversold, I have to tell you. But we now have the data. We're doing, we've got topic models. We're starting on our first couple of papers on that. The first paper, this is with Corinne Bendersky. We're looking at changes in sexual harassment over time. So that's another big study. And I'm really interested in social class. And so we have a couple of studies that look particularly at social class, especially family of origin social class for women who have kind of made it.
Yeah, Kathleen, before you decide to look at race, if you have it, with your European data, if you look at race or ethnic origin, you will probably find, and this might be worthwhile looking at, that when you have data on race or ethnic origin, you will probably have parents, mothers, who came from a country that is very different from the country you're looking at. This is Europe.
That's really interesting.
So in the former communist countries, you
Right,
will have mostly white people,
yeah.
whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And in some of the certain parts of Europe,
Yeah,
you will have strong subsets
yeah,
of people from Afghanistan, from Somalia,
yeah.
completely different in terms of background with respect to women.
Yeah,
So,
that's interesting.
Now, race is not going to mean in Europe what race means in the US.
So,
But it
what's
does
your
have
prediction
interesting
on,
implications, though,
yeah,
for how women's work
yeah,
will be seen in subcultures, racial subcultures or
Yeah.
ethnic subcultures within European countries.
so is your prediction that the effects will be much, much stronger for race in those countries than it would be in a sort of immigrant country like the US?
I would, so this is a hypothesis without having any
Yeah.
data whatsoever.
Well, that's
except
where we're
living
supposed to
there,
start our hypotheses, right?
is that you will have a much stronger, you would have stronger effects in the white majority
Uh-huh.
because people have lived there for generations
Yeah.
and it cuts across the generations.
Yep.
Then you will have in really recent immigrants, let's say,
Yeah.
say maybe second and third generation immigrants, you will still have strong cultural effects tied to ethnic origin and race.
Yeah, yeah, very
So
interesting.
once you split
look at
that,
that.
you should see some really interesting differences.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I am going to draw it to a close. Thank you again. This is really.